The clock on the grease-stained wall read 2:17 in the morning as Saraphina Cole collapsed into a cracked final booth, her trembling fingers spilling the night's meager tips onto the table. Every crumpled bill was a painful reminder of the rent she could not pay and the hospital debts still haunting her 2 years after her little sister Lily had died in her arms. She smoothed out a wrinkled $5 bill, her thumb brushing over Lincoln's face, when the shrill ring of the diner's phone shattered the silence like broken glass. Saraphina flinched, expecting a wrong number, or perhaps her landlord making good on his threats, but with a knot of dread tightening in her stomach, she walked to the counter and lifted the receiver. "Hello, Moonlight Diner," she said, her voice rough from exhaustion. The sound on the other end was not an adult, but the ragged, hitched breathing of a child desperately trying not to sob. He won't wake up," a small trembling voice whispered. Saraphina's exhaustion vanished instantly, replaced by razor-sharp alertness as the boy continued in a terrified rush. "There is red stuff everywhere. A big pool of it. And there is a knife in his tummy." The blood in Saraphina's veins turned to ice as the ghost of her sister's memory surged forward, and she realized that somewhere in the darkness, a little boy was watching his father die, and she was the only one listening. Saraphina gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white, the burn scar on her wrist stretching tight against her pale skin. This was not a prank call, and it was not a wrong number because she could hear the genuine terror vibrating in that tiny voice, a sound she knew too well from nights spent in hospital waiting rooms. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, forcing her voice into a calm, steady rhythm that betrayed the frantic pounding of her own heart. "My name is Saraphina. I am going to help you. Can you tell me where you are? Do you know your address?" The boy sobbed, a wet and jagged sound that tore at her chest, before he recited a string of numbers and a street name that made Saraphina pause. Wellington Heights. It was the enclave of the city's wealthiest elites, a place of iron gates and high walls that she had only ever seen from the window of the bus she took to her second job. "Good job," she soothed, though her mind was racing through a dozen terrified calculations. "What is your name?" "Theo," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "My name is Theo. Please come." He is closing his eyes. He is making a funny noise. The description sent a jolt of adrenaline straight into Saraphina's bloodstream because she knew exactly what that noise meant from her nursing textbooks. It was the sound of an airway collapsing, the sound of life slipping away. She should call the police or an ambulance, which was the reasonable and legal thing to do, but then the memory crashed over her like an icy wave. That night, the night Lily died, she had called an ambulance and done everything right, yet they had arrived 23 minutes later. 23 minutes in which Lily turned blue and cold while Saraphina screamed for help that did not come. She looked at the clock again and knew that if this man was bleeding out from a stomach wound, he did not have 23 minutes. "Theo, listen to me. I am coming right now," Saraphina said, making a decision that defied all logic but aligned perfectly with the broken pieces of her soul. "Do not hang up the phone. Keep talking to me." She slammed the receiver down on the counter for a split second, her eyes starting to the table where her 3 piles of cash still lay. Rent money, Lily's debt, the nursing school fund she had starved herself to save. It was her entire life in paper and coin. She looked at it for one heartbeat, just one, and then swept every cent into her apron pocket without hesitation. She did not know if she would ever come back to the diner, and if she was going to drive into the heart of Wellington Heights at 2 in the morning, she could not leave her lifeline behind. She grabbed her keys and ran out the back door into the biting cold of the night, leaving the diner unlocked and the lights humming behind her. Her car was a rusted metal box she had bought for $500 from a junkyard, a vehicle that coughed and wheezed every time she turned the key. Saraphina slid into the freezing driver's seat and prayed to a god she had stopped believing in years ago. "Please," she whispered, her breath fogging in the air as she turned the ignition. "Just this once. Please start." The engine sputtered and died, silence filling the small cavern like a tomb. Panic clawed at her throat as she thought of Theo alone in the dark with a dying father. She turned the key again, slamming her foot against the gas pedal, and the old beast roared to life with a violent shudder. She did not wait for it to warm up. She threw the gear into drive and peeled out of the lot, the tires screeching against the asphalt as she shot into the empty street. The dashboard clock read 2:23 in the morning, and Wellington Heights was at least 20 minutes away if she obeyed the traffic laws. But that man did not have 20 minutes, and neither did Theo. Saraphina pressed the phone against her shoulder, staring with one hand as she wove through the deserted city streets. "Theo, are you still there?" she called out, her voice competing with the rattle of the engine. "Yes," the small voice came back, thinner now, more fragile. "I am here. It is so quiet." Saraphina ran a red light, her heart leaping into her throat as she narrowly missed a delivery truck that blared its horn in the distance. She did not care. She could not care. "I need you to be brave for me, Theo," she said, pressing the accelerator until the old car shook violently. "Find a towel. A big one. Press it on the red stuff. Push hard. Can you do that?" I am scared." Theo wept, and the sound broke Saraphina's heart all over again. "It is sticky. There is so much." Saraphina swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes burning with unshed tears as the streetlights blurred past like streaks of yellow fire. "I know you are scared," she said softly, channeling the voice she used to use when Lily woke up from nightmares. "But you are saving him, Theo. You are his hero right now. Just press down and hold it. I am almost there." She pushed the car to its breaking point, the speedometer climbing past numbers the vehicle had never reached before. She was flying blind into a world she did not understand, driven by a ghost and the promise she had made to a sister she could not save. As the towering iron gates of Wellington Heights rose out of the darkness like the jaws of a beast, Saraphina saw they were standing slightly ajar, a silent invitation into a nightmare she was no longer sure she could survive. The gravel driveway crunched beneath the bald tires of Saraphina's rusted sedan as she navigated the winding path lined with manicured oaks that looked like silent sentinels in the headlights. The mansion rose from the darkness like a fortress of stone and glass, its windows dark save for a single, faint glow on the ground floor. It was a place built to keep the world out, yet the massive front door stood slightly ajar, a jagged line of shadow that whispered of violence and hasty exits. Saraphina killed the engine, leaving the car running because she feared it might never start again, and sprinted toward the entrance, her worn sneakers slipping on the polished stone steps. She pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into a foyer that smelled of expensive wax and the unmistakable, metallic tang of fresh blood. "Theo," she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous silence that felt heavy enough to crush her. A small figure detached itself from the shadows near a sweeping marble staircase, holding a blood-soaked towel like a shield. Theo did not run to her immediately, frozen by the trauma of the night, his eyes wide and vacant as he pointed toward the archway to his left. Saraphina moved past him, dropping to her knees beside the boy to quickly check him for injuries, but he was physically unharmed, only his soul bruised by what he had witnessed. "Stay close to me," she whispered, taking his cold, sticky hand and leading him into the living room where the smell of copper grew suffocating. The scene before her was a gruesome masterpiece of violence splashed across a room worth more than her entire lifetime of earnings. A man lay centered on a Persian rug that was rapidly turning a dark, sickening crimson, his massive frame sprawled in the unnatural stillness of the dying. This was Marcus Stone. Even in this state, he looked like a fallen titan, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, wearing a white dress shirt now dyed the color of wine. A kitchen knife, the handle protruding obscenely, remained buried deep in his abdomen, sealing the wound but doing nothing to stop the internal hemorrhage that was slowly killing him. Saraphina knelt in the blood, ruining her only pair of work pants, and pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck. His skin was clammy, cold sweat beating on his forehead, and his pulse was a thready, fluttering bird trapped in a cage. "He is barely holding on," she murmured to herself, her nursing training kicking in with a clinical detachment that shielded her from the horror. She checked his pupils and found them sluggish, his breathing shallow and rattling in his chest. An ambulance would take 15 minutes to navigate the winding roads of Wellington Heights, maybe 20 if they got lost at the gate. He didn't have 20 minutes. He barely had 5. If she waited for the paramedics, she would be waiting for a corpse, and Theo would be an orphan before sunrise. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had to move him. She had to take him to St. Mary's herself. She looked at the man's size and then down at her own thin arms, the wrists bony and scarred, the muscles wasted from years of skipping meals to pay bills. He easily weighed 200 pounds of dense muscle and bone, while she hovered dangerously close to 100 on a good day. "Theo, I need you to go open the back door of my car," she ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Run. Do it now." As the boy scrambled away, Saraphina grabbed the edges of the heavy wool rug Marcus was lying on. She could not lift him, but the polished marble floor offered a sliver of hope. She braced her feet against a heavy armchair, grit her teeth until her jaw popped, and pulled with everything she had. The rug slid a few inches, the dead weight of the man resisting her like gravity itself. A scream tore from her throat, raw and primal, as she hauled backward again, her spine feeling as if it might snap under the strain. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the endless expanse of the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. Her boots slipped in his blood, sending her crashing to her knees, the impact jarring her bones, yet she scrambled back up without pausing to wipe the red smear from her jeans. "I will not let you die," she hissed at the unconscious man, channeling every ounce of rage and grief she held for Lily into the motion of her arms. She dragged him through the foyer and out onto the porch, where the cold night air slapped her sweat-drenched face. The stairs were the nightmare scenario. Gravity took over, and she had to use her own body as a brake, sliding down the stone steps ahead of him, letting his weight slam into her back to keep him from tumbling uncontrollably. The pain was blinding, a sharp fire igniting in her shoulder, but she barely registered it as she hauled him across the gravel driveway toward the idling car. The final hurdle was the back seat. Saraphina stood there, chest heaving, black spots dancing in her vision from the exertion and her own anemia. She grabbed Marcus under his arms, his head lolling heavily against her chest, staining her uniform with his blood. 1, 2, 3, she counted, screaming through her teeth as she leveraged every remaining scrap of strength to hoist his upper body into the car. She shoved his legs in after, collapsing against the door frame for a second as the world spun dizzily around her. She had done it. She didn't know how, but she had done it. Theo was standing by the open door, shivering violently, his eyes fixed on his father's pale face. "Get in the back with him," Saraphina gasped, stumbling around to the driver's side and throwing herself behind the wheel. "Hold his hand, Theo. Don't let go." She slammed the car into gear, the engine whining in protest as she floored the accelerator, leaving the mansion of silence behind for the chaos of the road. The engine of the rusted sedan screamed in protest as Saraphina floored the accelerator, the needle trembling past 80 on a road designed for 40. The vehicle shook violently, rattling as if it might disintegrate into a pile of scrap metal at any moment, but Saraphina gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles ached, forcing the machine to obey her desperation. She blew through the first red light, her hand slamming onto the horn to warn a crossing taxi that swerved just in time, the driver's curse lost in the wind whipping through the cracks in her windows. In the rearview mirror, she could see only the dark shape of Marcus Stone slumped in the back seat and the small, pale face of his son hovering over him like a guardian angel. "Talk to him, Theo," she shouted over the roar of the wind and the engine. "Don't let him sleep. Tell him you're there." Her voice was raw, scraping against her throat, but she needed to hear the boy to know they were both still alive back there. Theo was sobbing, a continuous, high-pitched keening sound, but he was holding his father's hand with a grip that looked strong enough to break bone. "Daddy, please," Theo cried, his voice barely audible over the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "We are going for a ride. The nice lady is driving fast." Saraphina's eyes darted between the road and the mirror, checking for the rise and fall of Marcus's chest, but the shadows were too deep and the streetlights too sporadic. She banked hard around a corner, the tires screeching and losing traction for a terrifying second before biting into the pavement again. She knew the route to St. Mary's by heart because she had driven it 1,000 times in her mind during the nights she couldn't sleep, replaying the route the ambulance took when they lost Lily. Every intersection was a memory of failure, a ghost of the time she had been too slow, but tonight she drove with the fury of a woman who refused to lose again. Then, the sound from the back seat changed. Theo's sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was far louder than the chaos of the drive. "He stopped," Theo whispered, the terror in his voice cutting through Saraphina like a knife. "He is not making the noise anymore. His chest is not moving." Saraphina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. She glanced back and saw Marcus's head lolled unnaturally to the side, his face a mask of gray death in the passing streetlights. He had coded, "Respiratory arrest." "No, no, no," she screamed, slamming her hand against the steering wheel. She couldn't stop the car because if she stopped, he would never start again, but she couldn't drive if he was dead. She had to do the unthinkable. She had to make a 6-year-old save his father. "Theo, listen to me right now," she commanded, her tone shifting into the sharp, authoritative bark she used during emergency drills. "You have to be his heart. Do you understand me? I need you to climb on top of him." I can't," the boy stammered, paralyzed by the enormity of the request. "I will hurt him." Saraphina's eyes filled with tears, blurring the road ahead, but she didn't wipe them away. "He is already hurt, baby. If he don't do this, he will die. Climb on his chest. Put your hands in the middle, one over the other." She waited a heartbeat, praying, begging the universe for mercy. Then she heard the rustle of movement. "Push down hard, Theo. Hard and fast. Like this." She took one hand off the wheel and slapped the dashboard in a steady rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. Push to the beat. Don't stop. Don't you dare stop. In the mirror, she saw the small boy rise and fall, throwing his entire tiny weight against his father's massive, silent chest. It was a sight that would haunt her nightmares forever, a child fighting death with hands that should have been holding toys. "I am doing it," Theo screamed, his voice breaking with exertion and fear. "Wake up, Daddy. Wake up." Saraphina pressed the gas pedal until it touched the floor, the old car vibrating so hard her teeth rattled. She flew through an intersection just as the light turned red, ignoring the flash of a traffic camera and the blare of horns from terrified cross-traffic. She began to pray, screaming aloud to the empty passenger seat. "Don't take him. You took my parents. You took Lily. You cannot have him too." She didn't know why she was fighting so hard for a stranger, for a man whose blood stained her back seat, but she knew that if Theo lost his father tonight, the darkness that had swallowed her life would swallow him too. "Harder, Theo. Keep going," she yelled, her throat tearing. The hospital was close now. She could see the glow of the emergency sign painting the low clouds in red, a beacon of salvation in the black night. Suddenly, a ragged, wet cough erupted from the back seat, followed by a gasp that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface. He moved. Theo shrieked, collapsing back against the seat, sobbing with relief. He coughed. "He is breathing." Saraphina let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years, her body sagging with relief even as her foot stayed heavy on the gas. "Good job, Theo. You did it. You saved him." She swerved into the hospital entrance, tires smoking as she slammed on the brakes in the ambulance bay, ignoring the angry shouts of a paramedic who had to jump out of the way. She threw the door open and stumbled out, her legs trembling so violently they could barely support her weight. Covered in blood, wild-eyed and gasping for air, she looked like a madwoman, but she pointed a shaking finger at the back seat of her ruined car. "Help him," she screamed, her voice cracking, drawing the attention of every nurse and doctor in the bay. "He's alive. Please, just help him." The automatic doors of the emergency room hissed open, and the chaotic symphony of a hospital in crisis swallowed them whole. Nurses and orderlies swarmed the car like white cloud locusts, their voices overlapping in a frantic cadence of medical jargon that Saraphina understood all too well from her textbooks, yet felt distant and surreal in the moment. She watched, her chest heaving, as strong hands lifted Marcus's limp body onto a gurney, his blood dripping in dark, heavy droplets onto the pristine white linoleum. Male, approximately 35, penetrating abdominal trauma, hypotensive and tachycardic, of a resident shouted, shining a penlight into Marcus's unresponsive eyes while Theo clung to Saraphina's leg, burying his face in her blood-stiffened apron. They whisked the gurney away through a set of double doors marked Trauma 1, leaving Saraphina standing in the harsh, sterile glare of the fluorescent lights, shivering violently as the adrenaline that had sustained her began to crash. She was no longer the driver of a deadaway car or a savior in the night. She was just a waitress covered in a stranger's blood, holding the hand of a terrified child who had nowhere else to go. A stern-faced administrator behind the intake desk cleared her throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through Saraphina's daze. "Man, we need to process the admission," the woman said, her eyes scanning Saraphina's disheveled appearance with thinly veiled judgment. "Does the patient have insurance? Identification?" Saraphina shook her head, realizing with a jolt of panic that she didn't even know the man's full name, only that his son called him Daddy and he lived in a fortress. "I don't know," she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. He was stabbed. I just found him." The woman's expression hardened, shifting from professional indifference to bureaucratic wall. "Without insurance or a credit card on file, we require a deposit for emergency surgery," she stated coldly, tapping a pen against her clipboard. "Policy states we need at least $5,000 to book the OR suite for a John Doe." The words hit Saraphina harder than the physical exertion of the night. $5,000. It was a number so large it might as well have been $1 million. She looked down at Theo, who was watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes, trusting her to fix this just as she had fixed the car and the bleeding. She could not let him down. With trembling hands, she reached into the deep pockets of her apron, her fingers brushing against the wad of cash she had swept from the diner table only an hour ago. It was everything she had in the world. The rent money that was already late, the payments for Lily's lingering hospital bills, and the precious, secret stash she had been hoarding for nursing school tuition. She pulled it out, a crumpled mess of small bills and coins that smelled of grease and desperation, and began to count it onto the high counter. 100, 200, 1,267, she whispered, her voice breaking on the final number. It was a mountain of money to her, representing months of double shifts and skipped meals, but on the sleek hospital counter, it looked pathetic. "That is 1,200, the administrator said, not even bothering to touch the money. "It is not enough. The policy is strict." Despair clawed at Saraphina's throat, hot and suffocating. She looked at the closed doors where Marcus was bleeding out, then at the money that represented her future, her escape from poverty. It wasn't enough to save him. She had given everything, and it still wasn't enough. Then, The cold metal against her wrist burned her skin. She froze, her eyes dropping to the watch strapped to her left arm. It was a delicate silver piece, the glass face scratched from years of wear, the leather strap worn soft and thin. Her mother had unclasped it and fastened it to Saraphina's wrist the night of the fire, just minutes before the flames took her. It was the only thing Saraphina had left of her parents, the only tangible proof that she had once been loved, that she had once belonged to someone. She had starved rather than sell it. She had slept on park benches clutching it to her chest. Saraphina looked at Theo, seeing the same terrifying loneliness in his eyes that she had felt at 8 years old, standing in the ashes of her childhood home. She could not let another child stand in that darkness. With fingers that felt numb and clumsy, she undid the clasp. The watch slid off her wrist, leaving a pale band of skin that had not seen the sun in nearly 20 years. "This is a vintage silver timepiece," she said, her voice trembling, but gaining a steel edge of determination. She placed it on top of the pile of cash. "It is an antique. It is worth more than the difference." The administrator looked at the watch, then at the tears silently tracking through the blood and grime on Saraphina's face. For a moment, the silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the sacrifice. Finally, the woman sighed, picked up the watch, and slid the pile of money into a drawer. "I will mark this as a provisional deposit," she muttered, typing something into her computer. "But you will need to settle the balance within 24 hours. Saraphina nodded, unable to speak as she watched her mother's watch disappear into the dark drawer. It felt as though a piece of her soul had been amputated, leaving a phantom ache in her chest. She had nothing left now. No money for rent, no tuition, no family heirloom. She was completely, utterly destitute. But as the double doors swung open and a nurse hurried out to shout, "He is prepping for surgery. We have a heartbeat," Saraphina looked down at Theo and squeezed his hand. He was safe for now. His father had a fighting chance. She led the boy to the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area and sat down, pulling him into her lap as exhaustion finally claimed her. She had stripped herself of her past and her future in a single night, leaving her naked against the world. But as the boy's breathing evened out against her chest, she knew she would make the same choice again. The silence of the waiting room was a deceptive calm, a fragile layer of ice over deep, dark water, and Saraphina dozed fitfully with Theo's heavy head resting on her lap. She jerked awake not because of a noise, but because the air in the room suddenly changed, growing heavy and sharp with the static charge of violence. The automatic doors didn't just slide open. They were conquered by 5 men who moved in a phalanx of expensive wool suits and lethal intent, their presence sucking the oxygen right out of the sterile's face. Leading them was an older man with silver hair and eyes that looked like chips of flint, his face a map of hard decisions and buried bodies. This was Lorenzo, the consigliere. Though Saraphina didn't know his title, she only knew instinctively that the predators had arrived and they were looking for blood. The other patients in the room seemed to sense it too, shrinking back into their chairs, instinctively making themselves small to avoid the gaze of men who clearly operated above the law. Lorenzo's eyes swept the room with the precision of a targeting laser, bypassing the frightened elderly couple and the crying teenager, landing instantly on the woman drenched in crimson. Saraphina froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as the men moved toward her with terrifying speed. Before she could even draw breath to speak, 2 of the younger enforcers were upon her, grabbing her arms and hauling her roughly to her feet, dislodging the sleeping child who tumbled to the floor with a startled cry. "Secure her," Lorenzo commanded, his voice a low rumble of thunder that brooked no argument. "She's covered in his blood. If she didn't wield the knife, she knows who did." Saraphina tried to struggle, but their grip was iron, and the exhaustion of the night had left her limbs heavy and useless against their trained strength. She opened her mouth to scream, to explain, but fear choked her words into silence, leaving her trembling in the grip of men who looked at her not as a person, but as a loose end to be tied off. "I didn't do it." Saraphina finally gasped, the words tearing from her throat as one of the men twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her head down. "I saved him. Please, I brought him here." Lorenzo stepped into her personal space, radiating a cold, controlled menace that was far more terrifying than blind rage. He tilted her chin up with a rough hand, forcing her to look into his dead, gray eyes. "You expect me to believe a waitress with empty pockets and a rusted car dragged Marcus Stone out of a hit?" he sneered, his thumb pressing painfully into her jaw. "Who paid you? Was it the Russians? Or did Vincent promise you a cut?" He signaled to his men, and Saraphina felt herself being dragged toward the exit, away from the safety of the public eye and toward a dark sedan waiting at the curb. Panic flared white-hot in her mind because she knew if she got into that car, she would never be seen again, and her promise to Lily, her sacrifice, her life, it would all end in a shallow grave for a crime she didn't commit. "Stop it. Let her go." The scream was small, but pierced the tension like a bullet. Theo scrambled up from the floor, his face flushed with sleep and fury, and threw himself at the legs of the man holding Saraphina's right arm. He pummeled the expensive suit with tiny fists, kicking and biting with the ferocity of a wild animal protecting its mother. "She is the nice lady. She saved Daddy." The enforcer hesitated, looking down at the boss's son with wide, uncertain eyes, his grip on Saraphina loosening just a fraction. Lorenzo froze, his hand dropping from Saraphina's face as he looked down at the boy who was now shielding the terrifying, blood-soaked woman with his own small body. "Theo?" Lorenzo asked, his voice softening, the mask of the killer slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the concerned uncle beneath. "What are you saying, child?" "She drove the car," Theo sobbed, wrapping his arms around Saraphina's waist and burying his face in her stained apron. "Daddy stopped breathing, and she made me push his chest. She made him wake up. Don't hurt her, Uncle Enzo. She is mine." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when the world shifts on its axis. Lorenzo looked at Saraphina again, really looked at her this time, seeing the exhaustion etched into her pale features, the burn scar on her wrist, and the protective hand she had instinctively placed on Theo's head even while being threatened. He saw the truth in the boy's desperation and the defiance in the woman's eyes. He made a sharp cutting motion with his hand, and the men instantly released her, stepping back to form a defensive perimeter around the trio. "My apologies," Lorenzo said, though his tone remained guarded and sharp. "In our world, innocence is rare and coincidence is non-existent. You will stay here, under our protection, until Marcus wakes up and confirms this story." It wasn't a request, it was a command, but as Saraphina sank back into the chair with Theo clinging to her, she knew she had survived the wolves, at least for tonight. 3 days blurred into a gray haze of hospital coffee and uncomfortable plastic chairs, a limbo where time was measured not by hours, but by the rhythmic beep of monitors echoing down the hallway. Saraphina remained in the private wing Lorenzo had commandeered, not exactly a prisoner, but certainly not free to leave, though she wouldn't have left Theo anyway. The boy clung to her like a shadow, refusing to eat or sleep unless she was within arm's reach, his small hand constantly checking for the warmth of her skin as if terrified she might vanish like his father almost did. Lorenzo watched them from the corridor, his phone glued to his ear as he managed an empire on the brink of war, his eyes occasionally softening when they landed on the waitress braiding his nephew's hair. It felt like the eye of a hurricane, a fragile piece held together by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man in the ICU. But peace in their world was a lie, a temporary illusion waiting to be shattered by the next catastrophe, and it arrived not with a bang, but with the sudden, frantic shrill of an alarm cutting through the quiet afternoon. Nurses abandoned their stations, running toward Marcus's room with crash carts rattling like bones over the linoleum, their faces set in grim lines of professional panic. Saraphina stood up, pulling Theo against her waist to shield him from the sight, her heart sinking as she recognized the code being called over the intercom. Code Blue, ICU bed 4. Respiratory distress. Renal compromise. Lorenzo slammed his phone shut, the granite mask of the consigliere cracking to reveal the terrified old man beneath, and he stormed toward the doctors who were swarming the room. Minutes stretched into an eternity of muffled shouts and the whine of machinery until Dr. Harrison emerged, looking aged and defeated, stripping off his gloves with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the heavy silence. "His kidneys are shutting down," the surgeon announced, his voice flat and uncompromising. The shock from the blood loss was too severe. Acute tubular necrosis. Dialysis isn't working. His body is rejecting the catheterization due to systemic inflammation. Lorenzo stepped into the doctor's space, radiating the kind of lethal menace that usually made grown men beg for their lives, but Dr. Harrison stood his ground, protected by the medical reality that no bullet could alter. "Fix him," Lorenzo growled, reaching into his jacket as if to pull out a checkbook or a gun. "I don't care what it costs. Get the best specialists. Fly them in from Zurich. Buy a new machine. Just fix him." The doctor shook his head, a gesture of profound helplessness that silenced the consigliere's tirade instantly. "Money is not the issue, Mr. Lorenzo. Biology is. He needs a transplant, and he needs it within 48 hours, or toxins will stop his heart permanently." The weight of the sentence hung in the air, pressing down on Saraphina's chest, suffocating her with the unfairness of it all. To survive a knife only to die by your own body's failure. "Then get a kidney," Lorenzo snapped, though his voice wavered. "The black market. Donors. Find one." "It isn't that simple," Dr. Harrison sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. "Mr. Stone is AB negative. Less than 1% of the population has that blood type. Even on the black market, finding a match with compatible tissue markers in this time frame is statistically impossible." The words hit Lorenzo like a physical blow, staggering him back against the wall as the invincibility of the Stone family crumbled before simple genetics. He turned to his men, the wall of muscle and loyalty that lined the hallway, and barked orders with the desperation of a drowning man. "Test everyone. Every soldier, every captain, every associate. I will pay $5 million to anyone who matches." The hospital turned into a frantic processing center as dozens of burly men rolled up their sleeves, offering their blood to save the king, their faces etched with the grim hope that they could be the ones to save the empire. Hours bled away as the lab processed sample after sample, but the results were a relentless drumbeat of failure. Incompatible. Incompatible. Type O, Type A. With every shake of the doctor's head, Lorenzo aged another year, his posture slumping until he sat on the floor of the hallway, head in his hands, a titan brought to his knees by the cruelty of fate. Saraphina watched from the doorway, feeling the cold seep into her bones as she realized that all the money in Wellington Heights, all the guns, and all the power meant absolutely nothing against the inevitable march of death. Getty Images. Marcus Stone was going to die, not because of a traitor's knife, but because he was too rare to be saved. She looked down at Theo, who was drawing a picture of his father standing tall and strong, and the crushing weight of the promise she had made to Lily returned, whispering that it wasn't over yet. Saraphina stood in the shadows of the hospital corridor, the term AB negative reverberating in her skull like a church bell tolling for the dead. She knew that blood type intimately because she carried it in her own veins, a rare genetic quirk she had discovered years ago during desperate visits to plasma donation centers when her waitressing tips hadn't covered the electric bill. While Lorenzo paced the floor like a caged tiger and his men stared at the linoleum in defeat, Saraphina felt the cold weight of destiny settle on her shoulders, realizing with a sickening lurch that she held the key to saving Marcus Stone's life. She waited until the hallway was momentarily chaotic with a shift change, then slipped away from the sleeping Theo and found a weary phlebotomist in the lab, offering her arm with a quiet determination that brooked no argument. She lied, claiming the family wanted her tested as a formality, and watched her dark red blood fill the vials, praying to a god she feared had abandoned her that she wouldn't be a match, yet knowing in her gut that the universe was rarely so kind. The results came back 2 hours later, electronic text on a screen that sealed her fate with clinical precision. Positive match. Tissue compatibility high. Saraphina stared at the printout in Dr. Harrison's cramped office, the paper trembling in her hands as the surgeon reviewed her own medical file with a frown that deepened into a scowl. He didn't look at her with the relief of a man who had found a donor. He looked at her with the pity of a coroner examining a corpse. "I cannot do this, Miss Cole," he said, tossing her chart onto the desk with a heavy thud that made her jump. "You are looking at the compatibility numbers, but I am looking at you. Chronic anemia, long-term malnutrition, a BMI that borders on dangerously underweight. Your body is running on fumes as it is." He stood up and walked to the window, unable to meet her eyes as he delivered the verdict. "A nephrectomy is a major trauma. For a healthy person, it is routine. For someone with your blood counts, it is a lethal gamble." Saraphina felt the room spin, the walls closing in as the hope she had cultivated began to wither under the harsh light of medical reality. "What are the odds?" she asked, her voice sounding small and brittle in the sterile room. Dr. Harrison turned back to her, his expression grim and unyielding. 50%, he stated bluntly, stripping away any comforting bedside manner. "Maybe less. You could bleed out on the table before we even get the kidney out, or your heart could simply stop from the strain of anesthesia. You are asking me to kill you to save him." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk, his eyes pleading with her to be selfish for once in her life. "You are young. You have a future. Don't throw it away for a stranger, no matter who he is. Go back to that boy outside and wait for a miracle, because this isn't a surgery, Saraphina. It is a suicide mission." The hospital chapel was a small, suffocating room tucked away on the first floor, smelling of stale wax and desperate prayers. Saraphina sat alone in the back pew, her hands trembling in her lap as she stared up at the abstract stained glass that offered no answers, only fractured light. 50%. The number echoed in her mind like a death sentence, a coin toss where the wager was her entire existence. She was 27 years old, and she had fought so hard just to survive, scraped through poverty, endured hunger, and battled loneliness, only to be asked to throw it all away on an operating table for a man she didn't know. Fear, cold and paralyzing, coiled in her stomach, urging her to run, to grab Theo and flee, to live the life she had promised herself she would earn one day. But then, in the silence, she heard a voice from the past, clear as a bell. "Promise me you'll save people, Sarah. Promise me you won't be sad forever." Lily's last words, spoken through cracked lips in a room much colder than this one. Saraphina closed her eyes and saw her sister's face, not the gaunt mask of death, but the bright, hopeful smile she wore before the end. If she walked away now, she would survive, yes, but she would be breaking the only vow that mattered. She would be letting another child, Theo, stand at a grave and ask why no one helped. Saraphina stood up, her legs feeling heavy but her spirit strangely light, as if the decision had been made for her long ago. She walked out of the chapel and found Lorenzo in the waiting room, still slumped in defeat, a king without a kingdom. When he saw her approach, he straightened, his eyes dull and hopeless, expecting her to ask for money or permission to leave. "I will do it," she said, her voice steady in the quiet corridor. "I am the match. I will give him my kidney." Lorenzo stared at her, uncomprehending at first, as if she were speaking a foreign language. Then, as the reality of her words sank in, his face crumbled in shock. He scrambled to his feet, grasping her shoulders with desperate strength. "You? But the doctor said, "He said you are too weak. He said it could kill you." Saraphina didn't flinch. "It might," she admitted, looking him straight in the eye. "But if I don't, he dies for sure. And Theo loses his father. I won't let that happen." Lorenzo looked at her with a mixture of awe and horror, then reached into his jacket pocket. "Name your price," he choked out, pulling out a checkbook. 10 million. 20. Anything you want. I will give you the world." Saraphina reached out and gently pushed his hand away, shaking her head with a sad smile. "I don't want your money, Lorenzo. I am not selling a part of myself." She looked over at the sleeping boy curled up on the chairs, his face peaceful in oblivion. "I am doing this because no child should have to grow up alone. I am doing this for Theo. Just promise me, if I don't wake up, you will tell him I tried. Tell him I didn't leave him on purpose." Lorenzo dropped his hand, tears spilling freely down his granite cheeks, and for the first time, he bowed his head to her, a gesture of supreme respect from a man who bowed to no one. "I promise," he whispered. "On my life and on the honor of the Stone family, I promise." The next hour was a blur of paperwork and preparation. Dr. Harrison argued with her one last time, his voice rising in frustration, but Saraphina signed the consent forms with a steady hand, signing away her right to sue, her right to safety, perhaps her right to a future. When the orderlies came with the gurney, she asked for a moment with Theo. The boy was awake now, watching the commotion with wide, terrified eyes. Saraphina knelt before him, ignoring the hospital gown that hung loosely on her thin frame, and took his small hands in hers. "Theo, I have to go for a little while," she said, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. "The doctors and I are going to help your daddy get better." Theo's lower lip trembled, and he threw his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "Don't go, Aunt Sarah. Everyone who goes away doesn't come back." Saraphina held him tight, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence, engraving this moment into her heart in case it was the last thing she ever felt. "I will come back," she lied, or perhaps prayed. "I promise, baby. I will always be with you. Be brave for me, okay?" She kissed his forehead, tasting salt, and then let the nurses pull her away. As the doors of the operating theater swung shut, the last thing she saw was Theo standing in the hallway, small and alone, waving a tiny hand at the woman walking willingly into the fire to save his world. The operating theater was a sealed fortress of white light and sterile steel, a place where time seemed to distort and stretch into agonizing infinity. Outside in the corridor, the air was thick enough to choke on, heavy with the silent prayers of men who had long ago forgotten how to pray. Lorenzo paced the length of the hallway like a caged tiger, his expensive Italian leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum, while his soldiers stood guard with faces carved from granite. They were men built for violence, comfortable with the chaotic noise of gunfights and the metallic stench of street wars, yet this antiseptic silence terrified them to their core. They knew what was happening behind those double doors. They knew that the life of their king was being bought with the flesh of a woman who had nothing left to give. Theo sat curled on a plastic chair, clutching a worn-out teddy bear that a nurse had found for him, his eyes fixed on the swinging doors with the heartbreaking intensity that made the hardened enforcers look away in shame. Inside the surgical suite, the atmosphere shifted from controlled precision to frantic chaos in the span of a single heartbeat. The transplant itself had gone perfectly, the kidney flushing pink the moment it was connected to Marcus's blood supply, acting as an immediate lifeline for the dying Dawn. But on the adjacent table, the cost of that miracle was being collected. Saraphina's heart monitor, which had been tapping out a weak but steady rhythm, suddenly faltered and dissolved into the terrifying, singular drone of a flat line. "We are losing her," the anesthesiologist screamed, abandoning his charts to flood her system with adrenaline. Her blood pressure had bottomed out, her fragile body finally buckling under the massive trauma of the surgery and the chronic malnutrition that had weakened her for years. Dr. Harrison abandoned Marcus, who was stable, and threw himself over Saraphina's thin frame, beginning chest compressions with a violence that cracked ribs, but was necessary to force life back into her stilled heart. Lorenzo saw the flurry of movement through the small rectangular window of the hors d'oeuvres, saw the way the nurses abandoned their stations to rush toward the second table, and he felt the blood drain from his face. A code blue alarm began to blare overhead, a mechanical shriek that shattered the quiet of the waiting room and made Theo jump to his feet with a gasp. "Is that Aunt Sarah?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling, sensing the shift in the energy around him. Lorenzo couldn't answer. He couldn't look at the child he had promised to protect and tell him that the woman who had saved them all was currently dying a few yards away. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the observation window, watching as the doctor charged the defibrillator paddles. Thump. Her body arched off the table, a rag doll tossed by an invisible storm, but the line on the monitor remained stubbornly flat. "Come on," Lorenzo pleaded silently, his fists clenching until his nails dug crescents into his palms. "You didn't come this far to leave us now." "Charge to 300. Clear." Dr. Harrison's voice was muffled by the glass, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. The paddles slammed down again, delivering a jolt of electricity meant to restart the engine of her life. For a second, there was nothing, just the drone of the machine and the suffocating weight of failure. Then, a single, jagged peak appeared on the screen. Then another. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm was thready and erratic, barely there, but it was a rhythm. The medical team slumped in collective exhaustion, moving quickly to stabilize her with pressors and fluids, turning the operating room into a makeshift ICU. When the doors finally opened an hour later, Dr. Harrison emerged looking like a man who had gone 10 rounds with the devil himself. His surgical gown was stained with sweat and blood, his mask hanging loose around his neck. "Marcus is stable," he rasped, stripping off his latex gloves with shaking hands. "The kidney is working." "And the girl?" Lorenzo asked, stepping forward, his voice tight with a fear he hadn't felt in decades. The doctor ran a hand through his damp hair and sighed, a sound heavy with professional caution. She crashed on the table. Her heart stopped for nearly 2 minutes. He glanced back at the doors as Saraphina was wheeled out, hooked up to a ventilator and a maze of 4 lines, looking smaller and paler than death itself. "We got her back, but she is critical. She is in a coma, Mr. Lorenzo. Her body has taken a massive insult, and she has no reserves to fight with. The next 24 hours will tell us if she wakes up, or if she simply slips away." Lorenzo watched the gurney disappear down the hall toward the ICU, realizing with a sick feeling in his gut that the debt the Stone family owed this waitress had just become a debt of blood that could never truly be repaid. Pain clawed Marcus Stone back to consciousness, a jagged, rhythmic throbbing centered in his abdomen that felt less like healing and more like a fresh wound. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent glare, his mouth tasting of cotton and old copper, while the steady beep of a monitor assured him he wasn't dead, though he felt dangerously close to it. Lorenzo was sitting in the corner chair, looking 10 years older than he had the last time Marcus saw him, his hands clasped tightly over his mouth in a pose of silent prayer. "You're back," the old consigliere whispered, standing up with a stiffness that betrayed the days he had spent keeping vigil in a plastic chair. Marcus tried to sit up but fell back with a groan, his hand instinctively going to his side where a new, thick dressing covered the surgical site. "The knife." "Vincent," Marcus rasped, the memories of the betrayal flooding back like bile. "He missed the heart, but he killed the kidneys," Lorenzo explained, his voice grim. "You went into failure, Marcus. You're dying. We couldn't find a match." Marcus processed this information through the fog of anesthesia, his mind sharpening with the cold logic of a survivor. He was alive, which meant they had found a match, but Lorenzo's face wasn't the face of a man celebrating a victory, it was the face of a man mourning a loss. "Who?" Marcus asked, the single word heavy with suspicion because in his world, a gift like this always came with a blade hidden in the wrapping. The waitress, Lorenzo, answered, unable to meet his boss's steel blue eyes. Saraphina. She was a match. AB negative. She volunteered, Marcus. She knew the risks. She knew her body was too weak. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The woman who had dragged him out of his house, who had driven him through the night, had now carved a piece of herself out to keep him tethered to this earth. She crashed on the table, Lorenzo added, the words falling like stones. She flatlined for 2 minutes. She is in the next room, fighting to stay with us. Get the chair, Marcus ordered, gritting his teeth against the agony that flared when he tried to swing his legs over the side of the bed. Lorenzo opened his mouth to protest, to cite doctor's orders and recovery protocols, but he saw the look in Marcus's eyes, a look of terrifying intensity that could burn cities to the ground, and he closed his mouth. Minutes later, Marcus was wheeled into the darkened room next door, the silence heavy and suffocating compared to the chaotic noise of his own thoughts. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, a fragile figure swallowed by white sheets and tangled wires. Her skin was translucent, blue veins tracing mats of suffering across her hands, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of a lifetime of exhaustion even in sleep. Marcus signaled for Lorenzo to leave them, needing to face this dead alone, and wheeled himself closer until his knees brushed the edge of her mattress. He sat there for a long time, just watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, studying the woman who had defied every rule of self-preservation to save a monster. He noticed the burn scar on her wrist, a jagged mark of old pain, and the roughness of her fingers, calluses earned from years of scrubbing floors and carrying plates. She wasn't a soldier or a queen. She was a survivor, broken in all the same places he was, yet somehow she had kept her light while he had let his turn to ice. A sudden surge of emotion, foreign and overwhelming, tightened his throat. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from fear of breaking her, and covered her cold hand with his own. The contact was electric, a grounding wire connecting 2 storms. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes sweeping against her pale cheeks, and then she opened her eyes. They were brown, warm and deep like the earth after rain, and for a moment, they held no recognition, only the hazy confusion of the drugged. Then, focus returned, and she looked at him, really looked at him, not with fear, but with a quiet, devastating relief. "You made it," she whispered, her voice a cracked ruin of sound. Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling the pulse beneath his fingers, a rhythm that beat in time with his own newfound life. "You died for me," he said roughly, the accusation sounding like a confession. "Why?" Saraphina didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand to interlace her fingers with his, a gesture of intimacy that shocked him more than the surgery. "Because Theo needs his father," she answered simply, closing her eyes again as exhaustion pulled her back under. "And because I promised Lily I would save someone." Marcus didn't know who Lily was, but as he sat there holding the hand of the woman who bled for him, he swore that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to save anyone ever again. Marcus was not a man who asked for permission. He commanded reality to suit his needs, and staying in a hospital accessible to the public was a risk he refused to tolerate. 2 weeks after the surgery, despite Dr. Harrison's sputtering protests about post-op stability, a convoy of black SUVs spirited them away from the city's gray smog and up into the pristine, biting air of the mountains. The safe house was a misnomer because it was truly a fortress of timber and stone perched on a cliff edge, overlooking a lake that mirrored the steel of the sky and surrounded by acres of pine forest that whispered secrets to the wind. Saraphina, still pale and moving with the careful fragility of glass, watched the landscape shift from urban decay to wild beauty through the tinted window, her hand resting instinctively on the incision that now marked her as his. She wasn't just a guest here, she was the reason he was breathing, and the weight of his gaze in the rearview mirror told her that he knew it every second of every day. Recovery in the mountains was a slow, quiet rhythm that felt like a dream after the nightmare of the last month. Marcus, usually a phantom in his own home according to the rumors, became a constant, looming presence, his sharp suits traded for dark sweaters that softened the hard lines of his frame. He didn't hover, but he was always there, lifting heavy books for her, adjusting the blankets before she even shivered, his eyes tracking her pain levels with a precision that unnerved her. One morning, Saraphina woke to find the bedside table transformed. Where there had been sterile water pitchers, there was now a crystal vase overflowing with fresh lavender, filling the room with a scent she had once mentioned in passing during a delirium-fueled fever dream. She touched the purple blooms, her throat tight, realizing that the monster of Wellington Heights listened to her whispers when the rest of the world ignored her screams. It was a terrifying kind of care, possessive and absolute, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run from it. The nights were the hardest and the most beautiful, spent in the cavernous living room where a fire roared in a hearth big enough to stand in. Theo would fall asleep on the rug between them, his small chest rising and falling in the safety they had bought with their blood, leaving the two adults alone in the flickering orange light. They spoke in low voices, stripping away the titles of Waitress and Dawn to reveal the scarred humans beneath. Saraphina told him about the cold nights in her car and the hunger that never really left, while Marcus spoke of the isolation of power, of a throne built on bones that left him no room for softness until she crashed into his life. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the electricity of shared survival, until words felt inadequate. Marcus moved first, crossing the distance to kneel beside her chair, his hand, the hand that could order deaths without trembling, cupping her face with a gentleness that shattered her defenses. "You saved me," he murmured, his thumb tracing her lower lip, his steel blue eyes darkening with a hunger that had nothing to do with power. When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative, it was a claiming, a desperate seal on a bond forged in surgery and silence, and as Saraphina wound her fingers into his hair, she knew she had finally found the home she had been searching for. Peace is always fragile in a world built on violence, a lesson Saraphina learned the moment the front door of the lodge exploded inward, showering the living room with glass and splintered wood. The shockwave knocked her to the floor, the smell of cordite instantly overpowering the scent of lavender and thyme. Marcus moved before the dust even settled, his recovery forgotten as instinct took over. He shoved a heavy pistol into her hand, his eyes wild and terrifying as he pushed her toward the hallway. "Take Theo to the panic room," he roared, turning toward the shadows where dark figures were pouring in like smoke. "Do not come out until I come for you. Run." Saraphina scrambled up, grabbing a terrified Theo who was screaming for his father, and sprinted down the hallway toward the hidden panel in the library. Gunfire erupted behind them, deafening and chaotic, a war zone destroying the sanctuary they had built. She shoved Theo into the small steel-lined room behind the bookcase, punching the code with trembling fingers while the boy clung to her shirt. "Stay quiet, baby," she whispered, kissing his forehead as tears streamed down her face. "Daddy and I will be right there." The door hissed shut, sealing him in safety, but before she could follow, a heavy hand grabbed her hair and yanked her backward. Saraphina screamed, stumbling into the hallway to face a man in tactical gear, his face hidden behind a mask, a knife gleaming in his hand. He wasn't looking for money, he was looking for leverage. "Got the bitch," he shouted into his radio, grinning beneath the mesh. Saraphina didn't think. She reacted with the feral desperation of a mother protecting her cub. She grabbed a heavy porcelain vase from the console table, the one Marcus had filled with lavender just days ago, and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The ceramic shattered against the man's temple with a sickening crunch, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the wood. Saraphina didn't wait to check on him. She ran back toward the sound of the fighting, driven by a terror that Marcus was facing this alone while still healing from a major surgery. She reached the landing just in time to see the end of the nightmare. The living room was a ruin of broken furniture and bodies, but in the center, Marcus stood like a demon rising from hell. His shirt was torn, fresh blood seeping from his surgical incision, but he didn't seem to feel it. He had Vincent pinned against the stone hearth, his hand clamped around the traitor's throat, lifting him off the ground. Vincent clawed at Marcus's arm, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging with the realization that he had made a fatal miscalculation. "You thought I was weak?" Marcus snarled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "You thought because I bled, I was finished?" Vincent tried to speak, to beg or perhaps to curse, but Marcus tightened his grip, the muscles in his arm corded like steel cables. "You touched my home," Marcus whispered, leaning in close so Vincent could see the death in his eyes. "You threatened my family." With a sudden, brutal twist, Marcus snapped the traitor's neck, dropping the body to the floor like a sack of refuse. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by Marcus's ragged breathing. He turned slowly, his chest heaving, his steel blue eyes searching the shadows until they landed on Saraphina standing by the archway. The rage vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate, consuming fear. "Sarah," he gasped, stumbling toward her, ignoring the carnage around him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, shaking violently as the adrenaline crushed. "I thought I lost you," he choked out, his blood staining her clothes once again. But this time, it was the blood of victory, and as Saraphina held him amidst the ruins, she knew that the war was finally over. The seasons turned the mountain sanctuary from a fortress of snow into a cathedral of green, healing the land just as the months of quiet intimacy healed the people living upon it. On the anniversary of the night she saved him, Marcus walked Saraphina down to the wooden pier that jutted out into the obsidian stillness of the lake, the air thick with the scent of pine and the promise of summer. He stopped at the edge where the water lapped gently against the pilings and turned to her, his steel blue eyes stripped of all the armor he had worn for decades, leaving only the man who loved her with a terrifying intensity. He didn't offer her a contract or a negotiation. Instead, the most powerful crime lord on the East Coast dropped to one knee on the rough wood, disregarding the mud that stained his trousers, and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I have spent my life taking things," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that shook his hands. "I took power, I took territory, and I took lives. But you gave me everything when I deserved nothing. You gave me your blood, your body, and your heart." He opened the box to reveal a diamond that caught the moonlight, a beacon in the dark. "I am asking you to keep saving me, Sarah. Be my wife. Be Theo's mother. Be the only good thing I have ever known." Before she could even breath the yes that was already blooming in her chest, small footsteps hammered down the pier, and Theo crashed into them, wrapping his arms around their legs and shouting, "Say yes, Aunt Sarah. Say yes so we can be a pack." Saraphina laughed through her tears, the sound echoing across the water as she pulled them both down into an embrace that felt like coming home. The auditorium was a sea of black caps and gowns, buzzing with the nervous energy of hundreds of graduates, but Saraphina Cole saw only two faces in the crowded front row. Marcus sat there, looking dangerously elegant in a suit that cost more than the tuition of everyone in the room combined, holding a camera with a seriousness usually reserved for signing treaties. Beside him, Theo was practically vibrating with pride, waving a handmade sign that read, "That's my mom," in glitter glue that caught the stage lights. When they called her name, Saraphina Stone, Bachelor of Science in Nursing, she walked across the stage not as the invisible waitress who scrubbed floors for minimum wage, but as a woman who had climbed a mountain of glass and fire to claim her life. As she accepted her diploma, Her hand rested instinctively on the swell of her stomach, where a new life kicked gently against her palm, a daughter who would never know the hunger or the fear her mother had endured. She looked out at her boys, her wolf and her cub, and felt a profound, settling peace wash over her, a silence where the ghosts used to scream. She cast her gaze upward to the rafters, where a trick of the light looked like a girl in a hospital gown smiling down at her. "I did it, Lily," she whispered into the applause, her heart finally light. "I saved him. I saved myself." The guilt that had carried her for years dissolved, replaced by the certainty that promises kept are the strongest magic in the world. Saraphina had learned that family isn't always the blood you are born with. Sometimes it is the blood you spill together, the scars you share, and the choice to stay when running would be easier. She had walked into the darkness to save a stranger, and in return, the darkness had given her a light so bright it banished the shadows forever. This story reminds us that even when we feel empty, we have something to give, and that sometimes the act of saving another person is actually the path to saving ourselves. It teaches us that true strength isn't about never being afraid, but about acting in spite of the fear, just like Saraphina did when she answered that call in the dark. Thank you for spending time with us here at Sunni Romance. We truly cherish the opportunity to share these emotional journeys with you. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe, as it helps us bring more of these tales to life. We want to ask you, have you ever had a moment where a split-second decision changed the entire course of your life? Share your story in the comments below, because we believe every voice matters. Until next time, remember to love deeply, live bravely, and never underestimate the power of a promise.